The morning the sea became a killing ground. November 12, 1943. Rabaul Harbor, New Britain. 800 feet above the Solomon Sea. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto couldn't suppress his confidence as he watched the 4 American bombers approaching from the southeast. Standing on the bridge of the destroyer Akikes, he observed the distinctive silhouettes through his binoculars, Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, flying unusually low at perhaps 250 meters altitude. The Americans were making a mistake, bringing their high-altitude bombers down where Japanese anti-aircraft fire could reach them effectively. All gun crews to battle stations, Yamamoto ordered calmly. Those fools are giving us easy targets. At this altitude, our 25mm guns will tear them apart before they can drop their bombs. The Akikes, anchored in Rabaul's crowded harbor alongside 3 cargo vessels and 2 other destroyers, bristled with anti-aircraft weaponry. 6 Type 96 25mm automatic cannons, multiple 13mm machine guns, and trained crews who had faced American air attacks for months. Yamamoto had every reason for confidence. What Commander Yamamoto didn't know, what none of the Japanese naval personnel watching those approaching B-17s could have comprehended, was that those defensive machine guns mounted in turrets across the bomber's fuselage were about to demonstrate they could deliver more concentrated firepower than the destroyer's own main battery. Each B-17 carried up to 13 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, creating combined rates of fire exceeding 7,000 rounds per minute. At low altitude, those guns designed to fight off attacking fighters could be aimed downward at surface targets. The armor-piercing incendiary ammunition that could destroy aircraft could shred ship superstructures, penetrate thin armor, ignite fuel and ammunition, and kill crew with devastating efficiency. Within 3 minutes, the Akikes would be a burning wreck with 89 dead, her superstructure torn to pieces by thousands of half-inch projectiles traveling at 2,900 feet per second. The cargo vessel Hokushin Maru beside her would be sinking, her wooden decks literally sawed in half by concentrated fire. And Commander Yamamoto would be among the dead, killed by a burst of fire that hit the bridge with the force of a naval artillery barrage. The transformation from confidence to terror would take less than 60 seconds of sustained fire. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese naval personnel would create a new fear in Pacific waters. The sight of B-17s approaching at low altitude meant death delivered by flying weapons platforms that combined bomber payload with destroyer-level firepower. The 247 officers and men aboard the 6 Japanese vessels in Rabaul Harbor that November morning represented the Imperial Japanese Navy's hardened veterans of 2 years of brutal Pacific combat. They had survived American air attacks, submarine ambushes, and surface engagements. They understood war at sea, and they believed their experience and training gave them advantages over American forces they considered technologically superior but tactically naive. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, 41, had commanded destroyers since 1940. He had fought at Midway, survived the Guadalcanal campaign, and brought the Akikes through a dozen convoy escort missions that had cost other vessels. He understood anti-aircraft defense with the clarity that came from facing hundreds of American aircraft attacks. His ship's gunners had shot down 3 American fighters in the past month. He trusted his weapons and his crew. His executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Nakamura, 36, had specialized in anti-aircraft warfare. He had studied American aircraft capabilities extensively, memorizing recognition silhouettes, performance specifications, and tactical patterns. He knew the B-17 Flying Fortress as a high-altitude heavy bomber, maximum altitude 35,000 feet, typical bombing altitude 20,000 to 25,000 feet, defensive armament for protection against fighter attacks. The aircraft approaching at 800 feet was operating outside its design parameters, either damaged or inexperienced crews making tactical errors. Among the crew were men like Petty Officer Kenji Tanaka, 24, who manned one of the Akikes' 25mm cannons. Tanaka had been aboard destroyers since 1941 and considered himself expert at identifying threats. He had faced American dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and fighters. He knew how much lead to give a moving target, how to track aircraft through turns, when to fire and when to conserve ammunition. He watched the approaching B-17s with professional assessment rather than fear. The Japanese Navy's anti-aircraft doctrine emphasized volume of fire and crew training. Unlike American ships with radar-directed fire control, Japanese vessels relied on optical sights and experienced gunners. At close range, below 1,000 meters, this approach was effective. Japanese 25mm cannons, while lighter than American 40mm Bofors, could achieve high rates of fire in trained hands. Crews practiced constantly, and by late 1943, most had extensive combat experience. The Akikes itself was a Kajiro-class destroyer, 388 feet long, displacing 2,500 tons. Her primary armament consisted of 6 127mm guns and 3 twin turrets, designed for surface and anti-aircraft use. For close-range air defense, she carried 6 Type 96 25mm automatic cannons and triple mounts, plus several 13mm machine guns. Her armor was light, destroyers sacrificed protection for speed, but her anti-aircraft battery was substantial by 1943 standards. What neither Yamamoto nor his crew understood was that anti-aircraft defense assumed attacking aircraft would attempt to avoid defensive fire while delivering their own ordnance. Dive bombers dove, dropped bombs, and pulled away. Torpedo bombers launched torpedoes and disengaged. Fighters strafed and maneuvered. All these tactics minimized exposure to defensive fire. The approaching B-17's, however, were about to demonstrate a different tactic: sustained, direct fire while flying straight toward their targets, using their massive defensive armament offensively. The initial reports of B-17's attacking ships at low altitude with machine gun fire came from convoy escorts in the Solomon Sea during September and October 1943. The accounts were confused and often dismissed as exaggeration by survivors of traumatic events. On September 18, the cargo vessel Taman Maru, carrying supplies from Rabaul to La, reported being attacked by American heavy bombers flying at mast height, firing continuously. The ship's captain, Commander Yoshiro Matsuda, described the attack in his after-action report: "4 large bombers approached from the southeast at extremely low altitude. Anti-aircraft fire was ineffective, they were too close, moving too fast. They passed directly overhead, and multiple machine guns fired continuously. The forward deck was destroyed. 17 men killed, 31 wounded. Cargo ignited and burned for 3 hours." The report reached Naval General Staff in Tokyo, where analysts struggled to make sense of it. B-17's attacking at mast height contradicted everything known about American tactics. The description of multiple machine guns firing continuously suggested fighter attack, but the aircraft were clearly identified as 4-engine bombers. The report was filed as possible misidentification, likely fighter-bomber attack misidentified as heavy bombers due to combat stress. On October 3, the destroyer Uricase, escorting a convoy near Bougainville, encountered 3 B-17s at low altitude. Lieutenant Commander Masao Sato, commanding the Uricase, engaged with all anti-aircraft batteries. His report was more detailed: American B-17 bombers, positively identified, approached at approximately 300 meters altitude. Expected bombing attack. Instead, aircraft passed at close range while firing all turret positions. Observed tracers from nose, dorsal, ventral, and tail positions. Volume of fire exceeded anything previously encountered. Bridge structures damaged, 2 gun positions destroyed, 12 men killed, 23 wounded. Bombers departed without dropping bombs. This report reached Admiral Junichi Kusaka, commanding Southeast Area Fleet at Rabaul. Kusaka, a veteran naval aviator, understood the implications better than staff analysts in Tokyo. If American bombers were using their defensive armament offensively against ships, it represented a fundamental shift in tactical doctrine. More critically, it meant Japanese anti-aircraft defenses were inadequate against aircraft that could deliver sustained fire while absorbing return fire from their heavily protected positions. Kusaka issued a warning to all ships under his command: American heavy bombers conducting low-altitude attacks on surface vessels. These attacks use aircraft machine gun armament rather than bombs. Volume of fire is substantial. All vessels should engage these aircraft at maximum range and maneuver to avoid direct overflights. But warnings didn't address the fundamental problem. Japanese destroyers and cargo vessels had anti-aircraft defenses designed to shoot down aircraft attempting to avoid fire while making brief attack runs. B-17's conducting sustained firing passes presented a different problem. They could absorb substantial damage from light anti-aircraft weapons while continuing to fire. Their armored positions protected gunners from defensive fire. And most critically, their firepower exceeded that of the defending vessels. The mathematics were brutal. A Japanese destroyer like the Akikes with 6 25mm cannons could fire approximately 2,400 rounds per minute total, impressive firepower. But the rounds were 25mm, approximately 1 inch, diameter, with limited armor penetration and range. A single B-17 with 8 guns firing simultaneously delivered 5,000 to 6,000.50 caliber, 12.7mm, rounds per minute with superior armor penetration, longer effective range, and greater accuracy due to stable firing platform. The cargo vessels were even more vulnerable. Wooden-decked freighters with minimal anti-aircraft armament, perhaps a few 13mm machine guns and small-caliber cannons, faced attackers delivering thousands of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The result was predictable: shredded superstructures, ignited cargo, killed crew, and often sinking vessels. By early November, Japanese naval personnel in the Solomon Sea region had developed a healthy fear of low-flying B-17s. But fear didn't translate to effective countermeasures. The only proven defense was dispersal: spread ships across wide areas so attackers had to choose individual targets. But operational requirements often forced concentration, particularly in harbors like Rabaul where ships loaded and unloaded supplies. On November 12, Commander Yamamoto's Akikes sat at anchor in Rabaul Harbor, surrounded by other vessels, making exactly the target concentration that B-17 anti-shipping tactics were designed to exploit. The 4 B-17s approaching Rabaul Harbor at 0847 hours belonged to the 63rd Bomb Squadron, commanded by Captain Morrison. The mission briefing had been explicit: strike shipping in Rabaul Harbor using low-altitude attack tactics with turret armament as primary weapon. Each aircraft carried reduced bomb loads, 4 500-pound bombs rather than typical heavy loads, to maximize ammunition and fuel for extended combat. Morrison's crew consisted of 10 men, each understanding their role in the attack. Morrison himself as aircraft commander and pilot. Captain James Davidson as co-pilot. Lieutenant Thomas Chin as bombardier/nose gunner. Technical Sergeant Robert Williams as flight engineer/dorsal turret gunner. Staff Sergeant Michael Russo as ball turret gunner. Sergeant David Harper as radio operator/waist gunner. Sergeant William Foster as left waist gunner. Sergeant John Martinez as tail gunner. Sergeant Paul Anderson as right cheek gunner. Sergeant Frank Edwards as left cheek gunner. Each gunner had specific fields of fire and specific responsibilities during the low-altitude pass. The coordination had been practiced extensively. When Morrison gave the command guns free, all positions would engage simultaneously, creating a cone of fire that saturated the target area. As the formation approached Rabaul at 800 feet altitude, Morrison could see the harbor clearly: 6 vessels at anchor, approximately 200 meters apart. Anti-aircraft fire was already beginning, puffs of smoke from the destroyers as their main batteries engaged in barrage fire. The 25mm tracers were visible, arcing up toward the formation. Steady on heading, Morrison announced over the intercom. Target is the destroyer on the north end. All gunners prepare to engage on my command. Pilot to bombardier, I'm giving you control for the bombing run. Keep us aligned with the target. Chen, in the nose position, replied, Roger, I have control. Steady, steady, bomb bay doors opening, holding alignment. The Akikes grew rapidly in the windscreen. Morrison could see figures on the bridge, see the muzzle flashes from anti-aircraft guns, hear the occasional thunk of rounds hitting his bomber's airframe. His B-17, named Pacific Avenger, had taken hits before. The aircraft was designed to absorb punishment. At 600 meters range, Morrison gave the command, "All gunners, commence firing. Continuous fire until target passage." The effect was immediate and devastating. 10 machine guns opened fire simultaneously: nose turret, cheek guns, dorsal turret, ball turret, waist guns, tail turret, all converging on the destroyer. The combined sound was like a massive zipper being pulled, a continuous tearing roar that drowned out engine noise. From the Akike's bridge, Commander Yamamoto watched the approaching bomber with growing unease. The aircraft was taking hits. He could see flashes along the fuselage where shells were striking, but it wasn't breaking off. Then he saw the muzzle flashes. Dozens of them. Along the nose, beneath the fuselage, from the sides. All firing directly at his ship. The first round struck the bridge. The bulletproof glass windscreen shattered under impacts from armor-piercing rounds traveling at 2,900 feet per second. Yamamoto felt rather than saw the rounds hitting around him, sudden concussive impacts, glass and metal fragmenting, men falling. He tried to shout an order but discovered his throat was torn open. He collapsed, drowning in his own blood. The sustained fire lasted 23 seconds as the B-17 passed directly over the destroyer at 800 feet altitude, close enough that the crew could see individual Japanese sailors on deck before those men disappeared under the storm of fire. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Russo, had the clearest view. His position beneath the fuselage gave him perfect targeting perspective. He walked his fire from bow to stern, watching rounds tear through the thin deck plating, explode against the superstructure, ignite something forward that bloomed into orange flame. His twin .50 calibers cycled endlessly, brass casings ejecting into the collection bag, ammunition belts feeding from the reserve. "Bridge is gone," Russo reported over intercom. "Forward gun mount destroyed. Fires amidships. She's burning." Sergeant Martinez in the tail turret maintained fire as the destroyer fell behind. He could see chaos on the deck, men running, equipment destroyed, flames spreading. His rounds continued striking, penetrating the thin deck armor, finding vulnerable points. "Target is burning heavily," Martinez confirmed. "Listing to port. Secondary explosions visible." Morrison pulled the bomber into a climbing turn, gaining altitude while the other 3 B-17's made their firing passes. From 2,000 feet, he watched his squadron systematically destroy the ships in the harbor. The cargo vessels literally disintegrated under the concentrated fire, wooden superstructures torn apart, cargo ignited, holes holed below the waterline. One cargo ship, the Hokushin Maru, broke in half and sank within 4 minutes. The second destroyer, Asaka's, attempted to maneuver but couldn't build speed quickly enough from anchored status. 2 B-17's passed over her simultaneously, their combined firepower delivering over 8,000 rounds in 30 seconds. The destroyer's superstructure was reduced to twisted metal. Her anti-aircraft guns fell silent. Fires consumed the vessel from bow to stern. The entire attack lasted less than 7 minutes. The 4 B-17's expended approximately 24,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and dropped 16 500-pound bombs, most of which missed in the chaos. The ammunition did far more damage than the bombs. When Morrison turned Pacific Avenger southeast toward home, Rabaul Harbor burned behind him. 3 ships were sinking. 2 destroyers were total losses. 1 cargo vessel was burning out of control. Casualty estimates would later exceed 400 dead and 600 wounded across the 6 vessels. Morrison's crew had suffered minor damage, 148 hits from anti-aircraft fire, but all systems functional, no casualties. The armor around gun positions had protected the crew. The bomber's robust construction had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. "Pilot to crew," Morrison announced. "Good shooting. That's how it's done. When we get home, drinks are on me." But for Morrison and his crew, this was a successful tactical mission. For the survivors in Rabaul Harbor, it was revelation of nightmare. The Americans had weaponized their bombers in ways Japanese doctrine hadn't imagined. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura pulled himself from the wreckage of the Akike's bridge, blood streaming from a scalp wound. Around him lay the dead, Commander Yamamoto, the helmsman, 2 lookouts, the communications officer. The bridge structure was unrecognizable, metal twisted, equipment destroyed, everything holed by countless projectiles. He staggered to the rail and looked down at the main deck. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life. The wooden deck planking was shredded, torn into splinters by armor-piercing rounds that had punched through as easily as bullets through paper. The forward 127mm gun turret was a smoking ruin, its armor penetrated, ammunition exploded, crew dead. Bodies lay everywhere, men caught in the open when thousands of rounds swept the deck. The fires were spreading. Without effective damage control, most of the damage control personnel were dead or wounded. The flames were consuming the ship. Nakamura knew the Akike's was lost. His priority now was getting survivors off before she exploded or capsized. "Abandon ship," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "All hands abandon ship." As crew members began jumping into the harbor water, Nakamura tried to process what had happened. The Americans had turned their bombers into weapons platforms that exceeded destroyer firepower. The volume of fire had been unprecedented, thousands of rounds delivered in seconds. The ship's anti-aircraft defenses had been meaningless. They had shot down nothing while being systematically torn apart. The Akike's listed further to port. Nakamura made his way to the stern and jumped into the oil-slicked water. Swimming away from the dying ship, he looked back and saw the destroyer roll completely over and sink, taking dozens of trapped crewmen with her. Rescue boats from shore were picking up survivors. Nakamura climbed aboard one and looked across the harbor. All 6 vessels were casualties. The 2 cargo ships were settling into the shallow harbor. The Asaka's was burning. The remaining cargo vessels were damaged and listing. The harbor resembled a battlefield. "What happened?" a young sailor asked Nakamura. "What kind of weapon was that?" Nakamura didn't have an answer. He had seen the bombers, recognized them as B-17's. But what he'd experienced didn't match his understanding of bomber capabilities. The sustained, devastating fire from multiple positions. The armor-piercing ammunition that tore through ship structures. The apparent invulnerability of the attacking aircraft to anti-aircraft fire. "We weren't prepared," Nakamura finally said. "We thought they were bombers. There's something else. Something new." That evening, Naval medical personnel treated over 600 wounded survivors at Rabaul's base hospital. The injuries told the story of the attack: penetrating wounds from high-velocity projectiles, burns from ignited fuel and cargo, blast injuries from exploding ammunition. The doctors, experienced with combat casualties, were shocked by the nature of the wounds. These weren't typical of aerial bombing or even fighter strafing. The sheer number and severity suggested sustained fire from heavy weapons. Admiral Kosaka, surveying the damage at the harbor, understood immediately what had happened. The Americans had found a way to use bomber armament offensively. The tactical implications were profound. Any concentration of shipping was now vulnerable to attacks that conventional anti-aircraft defenses couldn't stop. The B-17, already feared as a strategic bomber, had become an anti-shipping weapon more effective than most torpedo bombers. Kosaka's report to Tokyo was grim. American forces have developed tactics employing heavy bomber defensive armament against surface vessels. The volume of fire from a single B-17 exceeds that of a destroyer's main battery. Armor-piercing ammunition penetrates ship structures. Concentrated attacks can destroy or disable vessels in seconds. Recommend all vessels avoid concentration, maximize anti-aircraft armament, and engage enemy bombers at maximum range before they can bring their weapons to bear. The recommendation was sound but difficult to implement. Ships had to concentrate for loading, unloading, and refueling. Anti-aircraft armament was limited by space and weight. 3 days after the Rabaul Harbor massacre, American technical intelligence officers at Port Moresby analyzed the attack results with methodical precision. The reports from Captain Morrison's squadron provided detailed accounts of ammunition expenditure, time over target, observed damage, and defensive fire encountered. What emerged was a statistical portrait of unprecedented anti-ship effectiveness. The numbers told a story that even the attackers hadn't fully comprehended during the chaos of combat. Guns firing simultaneously, 8, nose turret, dorsal turret, ball turret, both waist guns, tail turret, 2 cheek guns. Combined rate of fire, 6,400 rounds per minute. Rounds delivered in 30 seconds, 3,200 projectiles. Projectile weight, .50 caliber, 12.7 millimeters, 42.9 grams each. Total projectile weight delivered, 137 kilograms, 302 pounds. Muzzle velocity, 890 meters per second, 2,920 feet per second. Kinetic energy per projectile, 17,000 joules. Total kinetic energy delivered, 54.4 megajoules. To contextualize these numbers, Colonel Thomas Henderson, Air Corps Ordnance Specialist, provided comparative analysis in his technical report dated November 18, 1943. A single B-17 conducting a 30-second firing pass delivers more kinetic energy than a 5-inch naval gun firing 20 rounds. The difference lies in distribution. The naval gun delivers concentrated energy to single points sequentially. The B-17 delivers distributed energy across the target simultaneously, creating hundreds of penetrations rather than a few large holes. Against lightly armored targets, destroyers, cargo vessels, auxiliary craft, the distributed pattern is more destructive than concentrated fire. The ammunition composition was critical to effectiveness. The standard combat load mixed 3 types in roughly equal proportions. M2 armor-piercing incendiary, API. Hardened steel core, 10.7 grams. Incendiary compound, 1.5 grams of magnesium-based mixture. Penetration, 23 mm armor plate at 500 meters. Effect on target, core punches through, incendiary ignites after penetration. The armor penetration specification seemed modest, 23 mm at 500 meters, but was catastrophically effective against ships. Japanese destroyer bridge armor ranged from 10 to 15 mm, gun shields were 8 to 12 mm, deck plating was 6 to 8 mm, superstructure walls were often unarmored sheet metal 3 to 5 mm thick. The API rounds penetrated everything except the main belt armor and turret faces, and even those were vulnerable to sustained fire at weak points. Major Robert Chen, who had studied Japanese destroyer construction through captured plans and wreck analysis, explained the vulnerability in his December 1943 report. Japanese destroyer armor protection is concentrated around engines, magazines, and main gun turrets. The superstructure, bridge, fire control, communications, auxiliary systems, is unarmored or lightly armored. This concentration makes sense against naval shellfire where a few heavy hits determine the outcome. But against thousands of light projectiles, the unarmored areas become fatal vulnerabilities. Bridge destruction kills command staff. Fire control destruction blinds the ship. Communications destruction prevents coordination. Anti-aircraft gun destruction eliminates defenses. A destroyer can survive with its engines and magazines intact but is rendered combat ineffective by superstructure damage alone. The incendiary component multiplied effectiveness. Each API round that penetrated carried magnesium-based compound that ignited at approximately 1,900 degrees Celsius upon impact with air after passing through the target. Against wooden deck planking, the effect was immediate ignition. Against fuel lines, hydraulic lines, and ammunition, the results were catastrophic. The Hokushin Maru, the cargo vessel that broke in half during the Rabaul attack, had been carrying aviation fuel and deck cargo. The sustained API fire ignited the fuel, creating an uncontrollable inferno that burned through the ship's keel structure. M1 armor-piercing incendiary tracer, APIT identical to M2 API but with tracer element that burned bright red, allowing gunners to observe their fire and adjust aim. The tracer compound added minimal weight but provided critical feedback during sustained fire. gunners could walk their fire across targets, watching tracers impact and adjusting continuously. M2 Ball, standard full metal jacket projectile without armor-piercing core or incendiary compound. Still devastating against unarmored targets through pure kinetic energy. At 890 meters per second velocity, even ball ammunition could punch through thin metal, shatter equipment, and kill personnel. The mixed ammunition load meant roughly 1/3 of rounds were API, 1/3 APIT, and 1/3 ball. This combination provided both destructive effect and visual feedback, creating optimal conditions for sustained accurate fire. To understand why B-17 turret fire was so devastating to ships, Lieutenant Commander James Fletcher, a naval architect serving with Pacific Fleet Technical Staff, conducted detailed analysis of combat damage. His January 1944 report, based on examination of damaged Japanese vessels captured or photographed after attacks, provided forensic understanding of the destruction mechanism. Fletcher examined the wreck of the Akikes, which had been raised from Rabaul Harbor's shallow water in December 1943. The destroyer's superstructure told a clear story. Fletcher counted over 1,200 penetration holes in the bridge structure alone, an area roughly 12 meters long and 4 meters high. The density of impacts was approximately 1 hole per 0.04 square meters, meaning virtually every surface had been struck multiple times. The bridge structure resembles a colander, Fletcher wrote. There is more hole than metal in many areas. The armor plate that should have protected command personnel failed because the cumulative effect of hundreds of penetrations weakened the structure to the point of collapse. Even areas not directly penetrated suffered from fragmentation as nearby hits sent shrapnel through interior spaces. The ball turret gunner position proved particularly devastating to surface targets. Located beneath the fuselage, the ball turret provided unrestricted downward view and could depress its twin .50 calibers to fire almost vertically downward. Sergeant Michael Russo, the ball turret gunner on Morrison's Pacific Avenger, described his perspective. From the ball turret, I'm looking straight down at the target. I can see the entire deck layout, gun positions, crew, equipment, everything. I can place my fire precisely where it will do the most damage. I target the bridge first because that's command. Then I walk fire toward the gun mounts because those are their defenses. Then I hit anything that looks important, directors, rangefinders, boats, anything. The twin 50s never overheat because the airflow at 200 miles per hour keeps them cool. I can sustain fire for the entire pass without stoppage. It's like having a fire hose, but instead of water, it's armor-piercing bullets. The sustained fire capability was critical. Unlike fighter strafing runs, which lasted perhaps 2 to 3 seconds as the aircraft flashed past at high speed, B-17 gunnery passes lasted 20 to 30 seconds. The bomber's relatively slow speed, 180 to 220 miles per hour at low altitude, meant gunners had extended time on target. This allowed methodical destruction rather than brief damage. Technical Sergeant Robert Williams, dorsal turret gunner on Pacific Avenger, explained his technique. I start firing at 800 meters range. My initial aim is high to account for bullet drop. As we close, I depress the guns progressively, walking fire from the ship's stern toward the bow. I'm targeting superstructure, anything above the waterline. The rounds are punching through like paper. I see metal tearing, equipment exploding, fire starting. I don't stop firing until we're past the target. My twin 50s go through about 400 to 500 rounds in a single pass. The ammunition feed is smooth, no jams. The turret traverse is responsive. I can track the target throughout the pass. It's the most effective gunnery platform I've ever operated. The 6 B-17's expended approximately 38,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition and dropped 36 bombs. The ammunition proved more effective than the bombs. Most destruction resulted from sustained gunfire rather than bomb hits. Japanese survivors reported the attack as overwhelming and terrifying. Petty Officer Saburo Watanabe, who served aboard the Michishio, provided testimony when captured after the ship sank. The American bombers came from 2 directions at once. Our anti-aircraft guns were firing at maximum rate, but the bombers kept coming. Then they opened fire. It was like being in a storm of metal. Everything was being hit, the guns, the bridge, the deck, the boats. Men were cut down by the dozens. The fire was continuous, not in bursts. Hundreds of rounds every second. I saw the bridge explode under the impacts. The forward turret was torn apart. Fires started everywhere at once. In less than 1 minute, the ship was finished. We couldn't fight back, our guns were destroyed, our directors were gone, command was dead. We were helpless. In 1952, as part of U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's extended Pacific War documentation, American historians interviewed former Japanese naval officers about their experiences. Several testimonies addressed the B-17 anti-shipping attacks specifically. Admiral Kosaka, interviewed at his home in Tokyo, provided historical context. The American use of bomber armament against ships was innovative and effective. We had no doctrine for defending against such attacks because we had never imagined bombers would be used this way. Our anti-aircraft defenses assumed attackers would drop bombs or torpedoes from positions minimizing their exposure to defensive fire. The B-17 tactic inverted this assumption. The bombers deliberately closed to point-blank range and used their defensive guns offensively. The effectiveness derived from several factors. First, the concentration of fire. A single B-17 could deliver more rounds in 30 seconds than a destroyer's anti-aircraft battery could fire in 5 minutes. Second, the ammunition quality. American armor-piercing incendiary rounds were superior to our equivalent ammunition. They penetrated reliably and ignited consistently. Third, the aircraft survivability. B-17s absorbed damage that would have destroyed Japanese bombers. They returned with dozens of hits, repaired, and flew again. But the fundamental factor was American industrial capacity. They could afford to use heavy bombers for tactical ground attack missions. We could never waste strategic assets on such targets. This difference in resource availability determined the war's outcome more than any tactical consideration. Lieutenant Commander Nakamura, in a lengthy 1954 interview, described his personal experience. I commanded anti-aircraft defense on the Akikes. I had trained extensively, studied American tactics, prepared my crews. When those B-17s attacked, everything I knew proved irrelevant. The volume of fire was beyond anything I'd experienced. It wasn't like facing dive bombers or torpedo planes. It was like being in a typhoon of steel. The rounds were striking everything, the guns, the deck, the bridge, the boats. Constant impacts, hundreds per second. The noise was overwhelming, not discrete shots but continuous tearing sound. Men fell all around me. Equipment exploded. Fires started everywhere simultaneously. I tried to return fire but our guns were being destroyed as fast as we could man them. After the war, I studied American B-17 specifications. Each gun fired 750 to 850 rounds per minute. 8 guns firing simultaneously meant 6,000 to 7,000 rounds per minute total. In the 30 seconds they were over us, they fired approximately 3,500 rounds. Our entire ship was 118 meters long and perhaps 12 meters wide at the beam. Those 3,500 rounds had to hit something. And they did. Everything. I survived by chance. I was moving when the bridge was hit, happened to be behind armor when fire swept my position. Most of my shipmates died. Not from bombs. From machine guns. Naval officers aren't supposed to die from aircraft machine guns. But we did. Hundreds of us. Because the Americans found a way to turn defensive weapons into ship killers. Petty Officer Tanaka, the anti-aircraft gunner who survived the Akike's sinking, was interviewed in 1955. I was a good gunner. I'd shot down fighters, damaged dive bombers. I understood deflection, lead, burst control. When the B-17 came over, I was firing at maximum rate. I saw my tracers hitting the bomber, good hits on the fuselage and wings. But the bomber didn't react. didn't slow, didn't break off, didn't explode. Just kept coming while firing. Then I saw what their guns were doing to the ship. The wooden deck was disintegrating. The forward turret was torn apart, armor penetrated, crew killed. The bridge exploded. I kept firing, but my gun was hit and jammed. I abandoned the mount and ran aft. Men were dead everywhere. The ship was already listing. After I was rescued, I learned the B-17 I was shooting at landed safely at its base. Our 25mm hits had damaged it but not stopped it. Meanwhile, that one bomber had destroyed our ship. I was a good gunner, but my gun was inadequate. I was fighting an enemy I couldn't hurt while he destroyed everything around me. That's what the war became, us shooting at them ineffectively while they destroyed us methodically. The B-17 anti-shipping tactic never became widely publicized during or after the war. Strategic bombing campaigns in Europe received greater attention. The Pacific submarine campaign received extensive documentation. But the use of heavy bomber armament against surface vessels remained a relatively obscure tactical innovation. Yet the concept influenced post-war aircraft design fundamentally. The realization that bomber defensive armament could be employed offensively led to development of dedicated gunship aircraft, most notably the AC-130, which mounted artillery pieces and rapid-fire cannon and cargo aircraft for ground support missions. The principle was identical: take a large, stable platform and mount heavy weapons for sustained fire against surface targets. The B-17 anti-shipping operations also demonstrated that tactical flexibility and innovation could extend weapons systems into roles their designers never imagined. The Flying Fortress was designed to drop bombs on industrial targets from 25,000 feet. American commanders in the Pacific Theater looked at the same aircraft and saw a low-altitude gunship for destroying ships. Both applications worked because the underlying platform, or rugged, heavily armed, survivable bomber, supported diverse missions. For the Japanese Navy, the B-17 anti-shipping attacks represented another manifestation of American material superiority. The attacks weren't sophisticated, just brute force application of overwhelming firepower. But in war, sophistication matters less than effectiveness. American forces could afford to use strategic bombers for tactical missions because they had hundreds of such aircraft. They could expend millions of rounds of ammunition because their factories produced billions. They could absorb losses because replacement aircraft and crews were continuously available. Japan couldn't match this. By 1944, Japanese naval officers understood their nation faced enemies who could employ resources in ways Japan never could. The B-17 anti-shipping attacks symbolized this disparity: American bombers, designed for strategic missions, being used casually for tactical ground attack because the Americans had so many they could afford the diversion. The final assessment belongs to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who died in April 1943 before B-17 anti-shipping tactics were developed, but whose earlier prediction proved prophetic. In 1940, when questioned about prospects for war with America, Yamamoto had said, "I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, I have no confidence." By late 1943, 18 months after Pearl Harbor, American forces were indeed running wild, using heavy bombers as gunships, expending ammunition in quantities that seemed wasteful, and destroying Japanese naval assets with tactics that hadn't existed when the war began. Yamamoto's timeline had been accurate. His lack of confidence was justified. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, standing on the Akikes Bridge on November 12, 1943, had believed his anti-aircraft guns would protect his ship from those approaching B-17's. He was wrong. Within minutes, he was dead, his ship was destroyed, and the harbor around him burned from attacks that naval doctrine said shouldn't work but which worked devastatingly well. The Americans hadn't just made bombers into gunships. They'd made the sky itself into a killing ground where no ship was safe, and from which no courage or skill could provide protection. The defensive had become offensive. The bombers had become battleships. And Japanese naval power, already stretched thin across the Pacific, faced yet another threat for which no adequate defense existed.